Imagine finding out that one of the most stunning women in Europe was actually a prolific serial killer responsible for the deaths of over 650 young girls. She believed that bathing in their blood would grant her eternal youth. This chilling tale isn't a work of fiction. It's the documented history of Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian countess from the 1600s. She transformed her castle into a gruesome torture chamber, turning her pursuit of beauty into an industry of systematic murder. We're talking about someone who had young women delivered to her stronghold like packages, subjected them to horrific medieval tortures, and literally immersed herself in their blood, convinced it was the key to everlasting youth. What's truly shocking is that Elizabeth Bathory was never formally executed for her monstrous deeds. Her immense power, connections, and wealth shielded her from conventional justice. Instead, she was walled alive within her own castle, left to a slow, agonizing demise, a fate some might argue was even more dreadful than anything she inflicted upon her victims. And here's the most unsettling part. According to some historical accounts, her gruesome blood-bathing ritual actually seemed to work. Witnesses testified that she appeared decades younger than her true age right up until her death. This raises a terrifying question. What if her horrific method actually possessed some twisted scientific basis? To comprehend how Elizabeth Bathory became history's most prolific female serial killer, you must envision 16th century Hungary. She was born in 1560 into one of Europe's most influential families, the Bathorys. They weren't just wealthy nobles. They were akin to royalty, possessing vast territories and private armies that dwarfed those of most counts. Elizabeth seemed to have everything one could desire: immense wealth, striking beauty, and limitless power. Contemporary descriptions paint her as exceptionally beautiful, with pale skin, dark hair, and an almost supernatural ability to command attention. She was considered the most beautiful woman in the Hungarian court, a place teeming with Europe's most gorgeous women. However, the Bathory family harbored a dark secret, whispered but never openly spoken, a reputation for extreme sadism, mental instability, and what we now identify as psychopathic tendencies. Rumors circulated that Elizabeth's uncle was a devil worshipper who practiced human sacrifice, her aunt allegedly a lesbian who tortured female servants for pleasure, and her brother a known rapist who killed peasants for sport. So when Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander notorious for his brutal treatment of enemies, at age 15, it was like mixing volatile elements and expecting anything but an explosion. Ferenc, dubbed the Black Knight of Hungary for his savage warfare, even taught Elizabeth torture techniques he used on captured Turkish soldiers. The couple resided in Chachtis Castle, a formidable fortress in what is now Slovakia. Here, they reigned over thousands of peasants who were essentially their property. This was an era where nobles could legally kill their servants without repercussions, and Elizabeth quickly learned she could inflict torture and murder with complete impunity on those of a lower social class. But Ferenc died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth a 44-year-old widow with boundless wealth, absolute power, and no one to curb her escalating violent impulses. It was then that her obsession with beauty took a deadly turn. Elizabeth's descent from a beautiful noblewoman to a blood-bathing serial killer began with a single act of violence that would forever alter her path. According to historical accounts, a young servant girl was combing Elizabeth's hair when she accidentally pulled too hard. Enraged, Elizabeth slapped the girl so violently that blood splattered onto her hand. Instead of washing it off, Elizabeth noticed something that would compel her to commit hundreds of murders over the next decade. She became convinced that where the girl's blood had touched her skin, it appeared younger, smoother, and more beautiful. In her twisted mind, she had stumbled upon the secret to eternal youth. This wasn't merely vanity or a fear of agging. At 44, Elizabeth faced a genuine crisis common among powerful women of her era. She was considered elderly by 16th century standards, and her political and social influence were directly linked to her beauty and ability to attract and manipulate men. Losing her looks meant losing everything that made her valuable in aristocratic society. Thus, Elizabeth commenced what she called her beauty treatments with increasingly elaborate and horrific rituals. She started by having servants beaten until they bled, collecting their blood in basins to wash her face and hands. When this proved insufficient, she escalated to having girls hung upside down and cut, allowing their blood to drain directly onto her body as she bathed. Crucially, the blood had to be fresh, and it had to come from young, beautiful virgins. Elizabeth became convinced that the purity and youth of her victims would transfer to her through their blood. She developed an entire pseudoscientific theory about blood types, victim ages, and optimal torture methods to extract the most potent blood for her beauty routine. The process grew increasingly ritualistic and elaborate. Elizabeth would torture her victims for hours, even days, before killing them, believing that terror and pain somehow purified their blood, making it more effective. She employed medieval torture devices, including iron maidens, thumb screws, and instruments designed to slowly crush bones while keeping victims alive as long as possible. What began as occasional murders for beauty treatments rapidly escalated into an industrial-scale killing operation that transformed Chachtis Castle into what historians now term a murder factory. Elizabeth didn't just kill randomly. She established a systematic process for luring, capturing, torturing, and murdering young women, operating it like a grim business. Elizabeth's primary method for acquiring victims was to advertise positions as servants or ladies-in-waiting at her castle. She specifically targeted beautiful peasant girls aged 12 to 25, enticing them with promises of good wages, comfortable living conditions, and the chance to learn court manners. For impoverished families, having a daughter accepted into noble service was a tremendous opportunity that could elevate their entire social standing. However, the girls who arrived at Chachtis Castle were walking into a death trap. Elizabeth had converted entire sections of her castle into torture chambers, equipped with every imaginable medieval device. She had cells designed specifically for holding victims, drainage systems for collecting blood, and furnaces for disposing of bodies. The sheer logistics of her operation were as impressive as they were horrifying. Elizabeth didn't work alone. She recruited a team of accomplices who helped her capture, torture, and murder victims while maintaining the facade of a normal noble household. Her primary accomplices included Dorka Ilona Joe, Elizabeth's personal torturer, who helped devise many of the torture methods. Anna Darvulia, rumored to be Elizabeth's lesbian lover, who allegedly taught her witchcraft and blood magic rituals. Jana Ujvarieva, a governess who lured victims. Katerina Binikar, another accomplice. The torture methods Elizabeth employed were so creatively sadistic that they shocked even hardened investigators accustomed to medieval brutality. She would force girls to stand naked in freezing courtyards and pour cold water over them until they froze to death. She had victims sewn into horse carcasses with only their heads exposed, leaving them to be devoured alive by insects and rodents. One of her favorite methods was called star kicking, where she would have girls stripped naked, covered in honey, and tied up outside to be attacked by bees, wasps, and other insects. She would watch these torture sessions while eating meals, often becoming sexually aroused by the suffering she caused. The scale of Elizabeth's operation is what truly horrifies. These weren't crimes of passion or isolated acts of violence. It was systematic mass murder carried out over more than a decade with methodical precision. Conservative estimates suggest she killed at least 650 young women, though some historians believe the actual number could exceed 1,000. Elizabeth Bathory's reign of terror finally ended in 1610, but not because anyone cared about the hundreds of peasant girls she had murdered. Her downfall came because she made a fatal mistake. She began killing girls from noble families instead of just peasants. The investigation began when King Matthias II of Hungary received complaints from several aristocratic families whose daughters had vanished after going to serve at Chachtis Castle. Unlike peasant families who had no legal recourse when their children disappeared, Noble families possessed the political power to demand answers and the connections to force an investigation. Count György Thurzo, Elizabeth's own cousin and the Hungarian Palatine, was ordered by the king to investigate the allegations. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Chachtis Castle with soldiers and conducted what would become one of the most shocking crime scene investigations in European history. What they discovered inside the castle was so horrific that even hardened soldiers vomited, and some refused to continue the search. They found torture chambers still containing bodies in various stages of decomposition, cells filled with girls barely alive after weeks of torture, and detailed records Elizabeth had kept of her murders like business ledgers. Investigators found bodies buried in the castle gardens, stuffed into grain storage areas, and thrown into nearby forests. Some victims had been fed to Elizabeth's dogs or thrown into rivers. The evidence was so overwhelming that denial or cover-up was impossible. But here's where the story takes a truly insane turn. Elizabeth Bathory was never put on trial for her crimes. Despite having the most documented evidence of mass murder in European history up to that point, she was considered too powerful and too well-connected to face normal justice. A public trial would have embarrassed the Hungarian nobility and exposed the extent to which aristocrats could abuse peasants without consequences. Instead, King Matthias ordered that Elizabeth be walled alive within her own castle. Masons were brought in to brick up the windows and doors of her chambers, leaving only small slots for food and waste removal. She was essentially buried alive in a tomb of her own making, condemned to die slowly in the same castle where she had tortured hundreds of victims. Her accomplices weren't so fortunate. Dorka and 2 other servants were tortured until they confessed, then executed by having their fingers torn off with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Anna Darvulia had died earlier, possibly poisoned by Elizabeth herself when she grew concerned about loose ends. Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21, 1614, after nearly 4 years walled up in her castle tomb. But her death didn't conclude the horror story. It forged a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of beauty, agging, and the extremes people will go to preserve their youth. The most disturbing aspect of Elizabeth's story isn't just the sheer number of people she killed or the creative torture methods she employed. It's the fact that, according to multiple witness testimonies, her blood-bathing routine actually seemed to work. Guards who brought her food during her imprisonment reported that she appeared decades younger than her 54 years, with smooth skin and a youthful appearance that seemed impossible for someone her age. This raises the terrifying question of whether Elizabeth's methods had some twisted scientific basis. Modern science has indeed discovered that young blood contains compounds that can slow agging, a field called parabiosis that has led to legitimate anti-agging research involving blood transfusions from young donors to older patients. But Elizabeth's influence extends far beyond scientific curiosity. She became the inspiration for virtually every vampire story ever written. From Bram Stoker's Dracula to modern vampire fiction, the idea of maintaining youth and beauty through consuming blood became a central theme in horror literature, directly traceable to Elizabeth's documented crimes. More disturbingly, Elizabeth's story reveals the unsettling connection between beauty obsession and violence that persists today. The modern cosmetics industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars, is built on the same fundamental desire that drove Elizabeth to murder: the belief that youth and beauty are worth any price and can be maintained through the right products and procedures. Elizabeth Bathory proved that unlimited wealth and power combined with vanity and a complete lack of empathy can create monsters that make fictional villains seem rational by comparison. She wasn't insane in any legal sense. She was calculating, methodical, and entirely rational according to her own twisted value system. Her story also demonstrates how societies protect powerful individuals even when their crimes are undeniable. Elizabeth escaped justice not because there was a lack of evidence of her guilt, but because holding her accountable would have been inconvenient for other powerful people who benefited from the same system that allowed her to commit mass murder. Today, when you observe the lengths people go to maintain their youth and beauty, cosmetic surgery, expensive treatments, experimental procedures, remember Elizabeth Bathory. She represents the logical extreme of beauty obsession, illustrating what happens when the desire to stay young becomes more important than human life itself. The Blood Countess died alone in her castle tomb, surrounded by the stones that sealed her fate. Yet her chilling legacy lives on in every person who gazes into a mirror and ponders what they would be willing to sacrifice to turn back time. Elizabeth Bathory believed she had discovered the ultimate beauty treatment. She just had to murder 650 people to create it.